in association with Brookdale Lunch and Meat.
Ready?
Okay, day 3, the Judiciary. We got some vocab here today. Precedent. Precedent is a ruling that firmly establishes a legal principle. Every time a court makes a ruling, they are setting precedent. They are establishing these legal principles. All right, so take a famous court case like Brown versus Board of Education. What was the precedent set in that case? It was that separate but equal is unconstitutional. We want continuity and we want consistency in the law. So courts and judges are expected to use Starry Decisis. That's a Latin term. It means let the decision stand. And it's the idea that judges, when they're hearing a case, they should look back to similar cases, see what the precedents that were set in those cases, and then use that when deciding the case that's before them. That creates that continuity and consistency in the law. We don't want a bunch of contradictory court rulings. Otherwise, our court system and the law would be a mess. Binding precedent is the fact that lower courts must rule the same way higher courts have in similar cases. All right, so when the Supreme Court makes a decision, the lower courts are bound to those decisions. So when lower courts hear a similar case to already what was a Supreme Court case, they have to rule the same way. So for example, let's say that Georgia starts to tax a federal entity, or tries to. That lands in a lower federal court. Based on the precedent set in McCulloch versus Maryland, the lower court has to rule the way the Supreme Court did, which is that states can't tax a federal entity. So that's binding precedent. Lower courts have to rule the same way that the higher courts, the Supreme Court especially, have. Okay, judges, they are the final arbiters of the Constitution, right? They are the ones that are supposed to defend the Constitution. However, some are considered strict constructionists and some are considered liberal constructionists. Strict constructionists interpret the Constitution in its original context. They consider the framers' original intent. Liberal constructionists see the Constitution as a living document and they take into account societal changes. So, for example, a liberal constructionist would make the argument, they'd probably use the Eighth Amendment. They'd say, cruel and unusual in the 1790s was much different than what we consider cruel and unusual in 2020. It was common practice in the 1790s that if you stole a horse, you were going to be hung for it. But in 2020, there's a lot of individuals out there that would consider that cruel and unusual. So a liberal constructionist will say we need to take into account the fact that the meaning behind these words have changed because there have been societal changes. However, you still have those strict constructionists that say, we need to consider the framers' original intent when we decide court cases. This is a very important concept. I could actually see this becoming an argumentation essay. One of these days on the AP exam, it's this idea of judicial activism versus judicial restraint. When judges strike down laws and reverse public policy, they are said to be exercising judicial activism. Okay, so think judges acting to create law. Judicial activism, judges are actively creating law. And I know you're probably thinking now, how do judges actively create law? Well, I'll give you an example. There was a court case, Texas versus Johnson. Texas had a law that said you could not burn the American flag in protest. That case made its way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that flag burning is symbolically protected speech. It is free speech. Therefore, states cannot have laws that say that punish individuals for flag burning. That is activism, right? The Supreme Court, in making that ruling, are actively changing public policy when they do that, right? They're essentially legislating from the bench, all right? Proponents of judicial activism say that the court should act to achieve social justice when other branches have failed to do so. So there are those individuals that say that the judicial branch, when the other branches fail to achieve social justice, should step in and be activist. Okay, Brown versus Board of Education is considered an activist decision, as is the Obergefell versus Hodges decision. McDonald versus Chicago. Chicago had a law that said no handguns in the city of Chicago. That was struck down by the Supreme Court. That's basically the Supreme Court being activist. It's not considered conservative or liberal because both conservative or liberal judges have been activists in the past. Critics of judicial activism tend to point out that in a democracy, elected representative legislatures should create policy, not the judiciary. They advocate for judicial restraint. So proponents of judicial restraint argue that judges should only use judicial review if the law clearly contradicts the Constitution. Personal ideology or beliefs should not be considered. All right. Okay, that's it for today. We will finish up everything that we need for the quiz on Friday tomorrow. Again, that's going to be on Canvas. That'll be quiz 3.1. It's probably going to be about 20 multiple choice questions. So that's coming at you Friday. One more day of videos tomorrow, and that's it.